Right, so yes, I'm Julian Di Stefano from Melbourne Uni, part of the Phyroecology and Biodiversity Research Group. And today I'll be chatting about a web-based tool that colleague Holly Sitters and myself have put together to look at the interrelationships between fire species and habitat structure. But before I kick off, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we do our work, and also acknowledge DELP for funding this project. So as we all know, prescribed fire is used in many parts of the world to reduce bushfire risk, but it's also used for conservation management, for biodiversity management. But I think to provide a good basis for the use of prescribed fire for biodiversity management, we need to understand how species are responding to fire. Now, species might be responding to fire directly, and by that I mean that there's a direct correlation between aspects of the fire regime and indices of species abundance, say, or species might respond to fire indirectly. Now, a good example of this is that we know that species often respond to vegetation structure because vegetation provides important resources. And that aspects of vegetation structure are also mediated by fire. So species may respond indirectly to fire in this sense through the effect that fire has on vegetation. And I think understanding whether species are responding directly to fire or indirectly to fire, or perhaps both, is an important basis for using fire for conservation. I'd like to talk briefly about a case study, a piece of research driven by Rachel Nalia, looking at the interactions between fire, shrubs, foxes, and the endangered heath mouse, or Diane. And the heath mice are native rodents that have a very restricted distribution down in the southwest of Victoria. And Rachel's key question in this research was, the heath mice respond directly to fire, or does fire affect heath mice indirectly via the effect that fire has on shrubs and foxes? Now, I'm not going to talk about the fox part of this research today. If you're interested in the whole story, this article has just been published in a journal called Animal Conservation, so I'll let you look that up. I'm just going to talk about the piece of this puzzle that relates to heath mice, fire, and shrubs. Rachel used remote sensing cameras to measure heath mouse abundance, and she used the point intercept method to measure shrub cover. And let's jump straight into some results. Now, the box at the top of the screen represents post-fire age class, recently burnt, early, mid, and late successional. And the box at the bottom represents heath mouse abundance. And the first thing to say is that we found no direct relationship between post-fire age class and heath mice. We did, however, find a strong relationship between post-fire age class and shrub cover. The thickness of the arrow in this diagram represents the strength of the relationship. And the relationship looks like this. So we've got shrub cover on the y-axis, age class on the x-axis, and there is higher shrub cover in the recent and early age classes compared to mid and late. And we also found a strong positive relationship between heath mice and shrubs. When shrub cover increases, so does heath mouse abundance. So although we didn't find a direct relationship between heath mice and fire, the fact that fire influences shrubs and shrubs influence heath mice indicate that fire may be influencing heath mice indirectly through its effect on shrubs. It turns out that there's a secondary analysis that we can do to actually determine if this indirect relationship is statistically detectable. That's called mediation analysis. And the results look like this. What we have on the y-axis are age class contrasts, recent versus early, recent versus mid, recent versus late, etc. And what we've got on the x-axis is essentially an effect size measure. Now, the black dots represent point estimates of the effect, and the black lines represent 95% confidence limits. Now, what we're looking for to provide evidence of an indirect effect are 95% confidence limits that don't overlap 0, the vertical dashed line. And in this case, we have 3 of them. We've got a detectable effect associated with the recent mid contrast, the recent late contrast, and early late contrast. And this indicates that we have statistical evidence for an indirect effect of fire and heath mice mediated by shrubs. Now, what exactly is going on here? Well, think back to the relationship between shrubs and age class. What our mediation analysis is telling us is that the difference in shrub cover between the recent and the early age class, and remember that difference is driven by fire, is sufficient to alter heath mouse abundance. In addition, the difference in shrub cover between the recent and the late age class is also sufficient to alter heath mouse abundance. And the difference in shrub cover between the early and the late age class is also sufficient to alter heath mouse abundance. So although there wasn't a direct effect of fire on heath mice, we can say that fire influences heath mice indirectly through its effect on shrubs. Okay, I now want to jump in and talk about the response curve calculator itself. Now, Hamish in his talk before mentioned that a project that Fiona Christie has been working on has been to pull together a large amount of information that various people have collected over the last decade or so, looking at the interrelationships between fire, plants and animals, and habitat structure. And the key purpose of the response curve calculator is to tap into this wealth of data and to allow it to be accessible and analysed by a wide range of people. The response curve calculator has been built as a web-based tool. So what I'm going to do now is just unshare my screen for a moment and then reshare it so you can see the website, and I'll take you through it. So bear with me for just one moment. Okay, so you'll now be able to see the response curve calculator in its web form. What you'll see up in the the left-hand top corner is a drop-down list where you can choose your favourite species, and another drop-down list where you can choose your favourite habitat structure variable. Once the species is chosen, some analysis is running in the background. And the analyses are presented in 6 tabs, which are accessible across the top of the screen. The main result is shown graphically, but then under the graph, we've got some numerical outputs. And we've used a traffic light system. On the right-hand side, you can see some red crosses. So we've used the traffic light system so users can easily determine whether there are statistical effects or not. So red crosses indicate no statistical effect. Amber represents a bit of evidence for an effect, some evidence for an effect, and green represents a strong statistically detectable effect. So I'd just like to show you an example, and I'm going to choose the long-nosed potteroo, a species that Mark LaPlare talked about last week. So if we select long-nosed potteroo, some analysis runs in the background, and some results appear. Now, if we have a look at the first tab, it shows the relationship between species and growth stage. We've got probability of occurrence of the long-nosed potteroo on the y-axis and growth stage on the x-axis. Now, is there anything going on here statistically? Well, if we scroll down to our our results, we see a lot of red, which indicates no, nothing is going on. So this result is suggesting that for the data set at hand, which it actually comes from the Otways, there is no response of long-nosed Potoroo to growth stage. The second tab shows exactly the same data, but we present time since fire as a continuous variable on the x-axis, because it's nice to have a look at growth stage, but also time since fire as a continuous variable. In this case, there's a gentle positive slope, but according to the rules we've built in, we're saying, no, this is not a statistically detectable result. The next tab allows us to look at relationships between the species and habitat structure. We've got probability of Potoroo occurrence on the y-axis, and we've got bare ground. Now, why are we looking at bare ground? Well, it's just because it's first in the list. If we scroll down the page a bit, what we've done is we've built in a table that ranks the influence of the available habitat variables on the species in question. And so what we can see here is that vegetation cover between 1 and 2 metres above the ground has the strongest effect on Potoroos in this case. So let's go up to our drop-down list and choose vegetation cover between 1 and 2 metres. The analysis runs in the background and the result pops up on the screen. Okay, so now it looks like we've got quite a strong positive relationship between vegetation cover 1 to 2 metres off the ground and Potoroo occurrence. And if we scroll down, we see a big green tick. Yes, this is a strong statistically detectable relationship. What comes next is the relationship between our habitat variable, vegetation cover on the y-axis, and growth stage on the x-axis. So this tab is showing how our vegetation variables respond to fire. Not surprisingly, vegetation cover is lower in the recently burnt age class, and it doesn't change much as we move through early, mid, and late successional. Is what we're seeing statistically detectable? Well, these 3 green ticks here indicate that, in fact, it is. So what we're seeing here is contrasts between recent and late, recent and mid, and recent and early. And yes, those contrasts are all statistically detectable. Next, the same data is shown, but again, we've got time since fire as a continuous variable on the x-axis. And it looks like we've got a pretty strong positive trend. And our statistical results are reflecting that, a big green tick. And the final tab allows us to compute our mediation analysis, the analysis of the indirect effects. And this analysis takes about 20 seconds to run because there's lots of things going on in the background, and it's repeating some analysis over and over and over again to generate the confidence limits. And when it pops up, what we're looking for is 95% confidence limits that do not overlap 0. So again, this is the same graph as I showed you before. We've got our age class contrasts, recent early, recent mid, recent late, down the y-axis. And what we're looking for is the blue lines that do not overlap 0. So the first 3 effects here, the effects associated with recent early, recent mid, and recent late, don't overlap 0. So that indicates that we have statistical evidence supporting an indirect effect of fire on Potoroos mediated through vegetation cover. So in other words, fire influences Potoroos indirectly via its effect on vegetation cover between 1 and 2 metres from the ground. And again, just to make this clearer what's going on, if we go back and have a look at the habitat growth stage results, we can see that the big difference in vegetation cover is between the recent growth stage and all the others. And so our mediation results, our indirect effect results, are telling us that it's this difference, the difference in vegetation cover between recent and early, recent and mid, and recent and late, which reflects about a 30-odd% increase in vegetation cover, that is sufficient to drive an increase in Potteroo abundance. So although, if we flick back to the very first tab, although Potteroos are not responding to growth stage directly, we can say that they're responding to fire indirectly via the effect that fire is having on vegetation cover. So that's a bit of a cook's tour of the response curve calculator, this web-based tool that, that Holly Sitters and I have built. And the purpose of this tool, just to reiterate, the purpose of this tool is to tap into the huge amount of data that's available that explores the interrelationships between species, fire, and habitat structure. But as Hamish mentioned, these data haven't been readily available prior to this, and to make the analysis of these data accessible to a wide range of people. So hopefully the results can be fed into conservation management in fire-prone systems. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Julian. Wonderful tool, and I'm looking forward to mucking around with it. At this stage, you're off the hook for questions, Julian. So I'm just reading. Yeah. So there's a question there around whether the tool is more region specific.
The tool can be, whether it's region specific or not depends on the data that's available. So if the data are, the tool simply accesses the data that are available in the database. If the data are statewide, then the tool does a statewide analysis. If the data are regional, then the tool can do a regional analysis. There was a question, I think, about whether the results are split by vegetation type. Yes, the results are split by vegetation type, assuming that there are sufficient data in multiple vegetation types. So we've built in some rules that look at the data set and say, right, if there's sufficient data in multiple vegetation types, then we'll split each analysis and give you a separate result for the different vegetation types. That's a good question, and yes, the tool does do that.
Thanks very much, Julian. Really appreciate the presentation.